Marc Plattner, co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and Vice President for Research and Studies here at NED, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event. The event is timed to coincide with the appearance in the coming days of the July 2014 issue of the Journal of Democracy, which features a set of 8 articles on Ukraine. In fact, we just this morning got a few advanced copies of the issue. You should have received copies of the cover, though, when you came in. And I'm also pleased to announce that our publisher, the Johns Hopkins University Press, has agreed to make the full set of Ukraine articles available for a limited time, free of charge, on our website at www.journalofdemocracy.org. Rarely have we devoted so many of the journal's pages to a single country, but the importance of the events in Ukraine over the past 8 months certainly merits that kind of intensive coverage. The effort to rebuild democracy in Ukraine and to put it on firm foundations is surely the biggest democracy story of this year. It may well be the most important democratic struggle of the past decade, perhaps surpassing in global impact even the Arab Spring. From the beginning, the Ukraine story had a significant, if sometimes hidden, geopolitical component, as Russia and the European Union each competed to draw Ukraine into its own economic and political orbit. After months of protests by Ukrainian citizens on the Maidan succeeded in bringing down the increasingly authoritarian regime of Viktor Yanukovych, this geopolitical aspect was nakedly revealed as Russia invaded and annexed Crimea and began supporting separatist elements in southeastern Ukraine. Although Ukraine now has a new freely elected president and a government committed to bringing the country a democratic future, this is an extraordinarily challenging task, as it must simultaneously deal with Russian-backed armed elements on its soil. So the Ukraine story of 2014 is far from over. In fact, if you glance at the news today, you'll see that there's still quite a bit going on. But many of the chapters of that story have already been written, and we feel this is an opportune moment to discuss what has been accomplished so far and what remains to be done. And I believe the articles on Ukraine in the July Journal of Democracy offer an excellent beginning point for such a discussion. The majority of the contributors to the Journal of Democracy's cluster on Ukraine are based overseas, but we're fortunate to have with us on today's panel all 4 of the authors who reside on this continent. Let me introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. First, Serhiy Kudelia, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Baylor University, has previously held teaching and research positions at George Washington University, University of Toronto, SAIS, the University of Greifswald in Germany, and the Kiev Mohila Academy, is that right, in Ukraine. His articles have appeared in a number of journals focusing on the post-communist world, as well as in several edited volumes. And he's the co-author of The Strategy of Campaigning, Lessons from Ronald Reagan and Boris Yeltsin. I'd be curious to know sometime how you came to write that book. Second up will be Lucan Way, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. He's the co-author with Stephen Levitsky of the much-discussed book, Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War. He's completing a new book manuscript entitled Pluralism by Default and the Sources of Political Competition in the Former Soviet Union. And he's also beginning a new book project with Stephen Levitsky that explores the impact of violent revolutionary origins on the durability of authoritarian regimes. And Lucan is also a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Democracy. Anders Aslund on my left is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and an adjunct professor at Georgetown. He worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace from 1994 to 2005, first as a senior associate and then as director of the Russia and Eurasia program. He served as an economic advisor to the government of Russia in 1991 to 94 and the government of Ukraine in 1994 to 97. He was the founding director of the Stockholm Institute of East European Economics, and, something I did not know, he worked as a Swedish diplomat in Kuwait, Poland, Geneva, and Moscow. Anders is the author of 13 books, including How Ukraine Became a Market Economy and Democracy, published in 2009. Nadia Diuk, on my right, is Vice President of Programs on Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Eurasia at the National Endowment for Democracy. You see most of the world is under her supervision. For over 20 years, however, prior to her appointment as Vice President, she supervised NED programs in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Earlier in her career, she taught Soviet politics and Russian history and was editor-in-chief of the London-based publication Soviet Nationality Survey. Her most recent book is The Next Generation in Russia, Ukraine, and Azerbaijan, Youth, Politics, Identity, and Change. Each of our panelists initially will speak for about 10 minutes. I may then pose a question or two to them before taking questions and comments from the audience. Those of you on Twitter can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at NEDemocracy. If you've not already done so, please take a moment in joining me in silencing your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the editorial staff, my colleagues at the Journal of Democracy, Bill Kostopoulos, Tracy Brown, and Brent Kalmer, for their excellent work on this issue of the journal, as well as the staff of the International Forum for Democratic Studies for helping to organize this meeting. And now it's my pleasure to call on Serhiy Kudelia. Serhiy?
First of all, Mark, thanks for inviting me to contribute to this issue. And also congratulations on this marvelous job of putting together the fantastic set of articles that really cover all different dimensions of the revolution in Ukraine. I also was very impressed with the editorial work of people at Journal of Democracy. Really enjoyed working with them. So thanks a lot again for putting it all together and helping us along the way. Now, my task in the article was to analyze the evolution of authoritarian regime in Ukraine, identify its peculiar features that are different from the way authoritarian regime existed in Ukraine under Kuchma, for example, compare it possibly to Putin's Russia, and then explain how these features played out during the revolution. And so I'll start with specifying these peculiar elements of the authoritarian regime under Yanukovych, then talk about the key turning points in the revolution itself and the way these turning points basically contributed to the outcome that we've seen. And also, at the end, try to discuss whether it was really structure that mattered in the outcome or it was something about Yanukovych, his personal strategies that really led to this result. So let me start with these key features. The first key feature, which I think I talked a lot about during my last presentation here at NED last year at the panel that was called Turning Points, so not Turning Points, but the Ukraine at the turning point of its development, the concentration of formal powers in the hands of Yanukovych, which turned the president, after the constitutional revision in 2010, into a dominant institutional player who had very limited external accountability and full control over the coercive instruments. It's important to understand that Yanukovych was the first president in the history of Ukraine that fully controlled the parliament. So basically up until the last day of the revolution, Yanukovych could rely on the majority of the parliament to do the bidding for him. Neither Kuchma, nor Yushchenko, nor Kravchuk had the similar advantage. Similarly, even under Kuchma times, the judiciary branch was not as dependent politically on the president as was the judiciary under Yanukovych. One of the key examples of that was the fact that Kuchma actually failed to put Tymoshenko in jail when he tried in 2001, exactly because the court actually let her go. Obviously, Yanukovych was much more effective in this regard. The second institutional feature of the regime was the gradual narrowing of the ruling coalition behind Yanukovych and a change in its composition. So initially, if you remember, in 2010, when Yanukovych became president, he included in the ruling coalition many of his key loyalists from the times in Donetsk and from the times after the Orange Revolution. It included really a broader set of business and political elites, but the turning point, and so these individuals received access both to government positions, access to rents, something that Anders Aslund talks about in his article, but the turning point in the change of the ruling coalition was the parliamentary election of 2012, where you had a major reshuffling of the Azarov government that led to the inclusion of the so-called cohort of young reformers. Of course, they were not reformers at all. They were doing the bidding for the family, but they were presented to the West, to the external audience, as this new face of the Yanukovych regime that was supposed to symbolize the modernizing character of Yanukovych's autocracy. Many of them visited DC a number of times, and that's how they were spinned here as this new face of Yanukovych's modernized authoritarian regime. Of course, it was more than just personal greed. So many analysts say, well, he did that. He included all these young people who were basically looting the government budget for the family, for Yanukovych personally, that this was the result of his personal greed. To some extent, yes, but in addition to that, it also symbolized a different political strategy that Yanukovych chose in 2012, and that strategy was an attempt to create an independent financial base. Before that, in most of the previous parliamentary and presidential elections, Yanukovych heavily relied on the funding from the oligarchs, including Akhmetov and others, who provided key funding for the campaigns. In 2012, he decided to become the chief oligarch in Ukraine, and to minimize his dependence on any other actors, financial actors in Ukraine. And so that was partially why you had this heavy presence of these younger people who did the bidding for the family. The third key feature is the evolving role of the political party. So again, differently from all the previous presidents, Yanukovych became the first president who was nominated by the political party. He was a member of the political party, and he was the informal leader of the political party of regions for his entire presidency. None of the previous presidents were affiliated with the political party to the same extent, and none of the previous presidents used political party resources to the same extent. So if you look at the first appointments in 2010, 90% of the governors in Ukraine were appointed, were members of the Party of Regions, and they also combined their role in the government, in the local government, with their control over the party organizations in these localities. So a person was a governor in a particular oblast, but also was the head of the Party of Regions headquarters in that particular oblast. And in that sense, he tried to imitate the success of the United Russia, where Putin was similarly adopting a similar strategy in expanding his control over the regions through the presence of the political party. Another factor that helped, that was critical for his strategy of party building was the goal of maintaining the cohesion within the political elite. And there are a number of articles that write, including Lucan articles that write about the role of political parties in authoritarian regimes as a way to prevent defections to the other side, to prevent defection to the opposition. I doubt Yanukovych was reading political science articles when he devised this strategy, but maybe intuition really, or again, try to copy the success of the United Russia in Putin's regime was partially the reason why he chose that strategy. The fourth interesting feature was, and that was different from what we're seeing in Russia, is a decision to maintain a relative, to give a relative independence for the oligarchs in terms of their political investments. So I think Yanukovych understood early on that the opposition cannot be destroyed fully in Ukraine for different reasons, including structural reasons, regional reasons. So the way you deal with the opposition is you try to buy them. Right? And so we've seen a huge number of investments going into the opposition parties from the financial sources that were affiliated with Yanukovych. And it was initially very hard to explain why that was happening. Some explained it as personal strategies of the oligarchs, but Yanukovych was aware of that. One of the key examples is Klitschko's ties to Firtash Group and a large number of financial support he received from Firtash in the parliamentary election of 2012 and later on. That gave Yanukovych control both internally over some of the opposition factions, so some of the members of the parliament were affiliated with these financial groups. And it was also an expectation that you will make the opposition more manageable. It will make opposition more compromising. And so I would explain a little later how that really played a role in the negotiations during the revolution. The fifth important element is the salience of regional ethnocultural divides. In 2010, there was a set of articles in Journal of Democracy, I think it was 2012, 2011, on the presidential election. One of the contributing authors to these articles was Paul Danieri, a good friend of mine, my former professor from Lviv University. He was an American teacher at the University of Florida, where he talks about the fact that because of these ethnocultural divides in Ukraine, authoritarianism will never work. Even if you try to build an authoritarian regime, you will always fail because you have this big stronghold, large part of the country that will not support the other side. And initially, from what we already know about the evolution of the regime, there were attempts to try to bring the Western Ukraine to the side of Yanukovych, to expand his presence in Western Ukraine and co-opt some of the voters. Some people around Yanukovych, like Hannah Herman, for example, advocated that. They were using material resources, so Euro 2012, and the idea of holding the Olympics in the Carpathian Mountains in 2022 were the ways to show to Western Ukrainian voters that Yanukovych cares about them too. I think early on in his presidency, and that's what Hannah Herman confirms in her, some of her interviews, Yanukovych understood that this strategy is not going to work. And as a result, these ethnocultural divides continued to play a role for the entire presidency, and he was not very successful in that. So that was one of the key obstacles to his success in authoritarian consolidation. Several other obstacles to his failure to consolidate the authoritarian regime: low mobilization potential of his supporters from Donbass, the fact that he maintained the key support within Donbass region, he failed to expand it westward, was one of the problems, as I mentioned. The second obstacle was the failure to develop an ideological base for his rule, something that Putin was more successful in doing. And as a result, we've seen ideologically a reliance on the old standard appeals to the European identity. Some interpreted it as a conversion of Yanukovych to European values, to democratic values, an example that Yanukovych can actually be a Democrat. But in reality, I think it was a default option for Yanukovych, who really did not have much of an ideology to talk about. So he used the very same European destiny arguments that Kuchma used before him and Yushchenko used before him, without obviously believing much in those. And finally, his failure to deal with the opposition, to co-opt the opposition. Obviously, the fact that he jailed Tymoshenko did not destroy the opposition to the same extent as he hoped. And in many respects, it actually strengthened the opposition because it created incentives for many opposition leaders to actually align and create an alliance in the fear of being next in the jail cell next to Tymoshenko. What influenced the regime, the trajectory of regime in the final 3 months? I'll be since I'm running out of time, very quickly go through several. So first of all, the absence of institutional checks was actually a curse in disguise for Yanukovych. On one hand, it helped him to maintain his power for quite some time, but at the same time, it gave him a wrong sense of impunity, an illusion that he can actually win that struggle. And that encouraged a lot of abusive actions against protesters, both by him and by his subordinates in the law enforcement agents. The sense of strategic advantage, because he kept that cohesion at the top, the fact that because there was really very few defections from his side to the side of the opposition, the fact that he controlled the parliament until the very end gave him that sense of advantage that he possessed over the opposition, that made him less willing to make compromises at the beginning of the crisis. Also, the uneven loss of legitimacy. So he created the fact that the substantial part of Ukraine, Donbass, for example, still supported Yanukovych, also gave him the illusion that he, with the help of the Eastern Ukraine, he can survive this crisis and actually win the re-election in 2015. By the end of the crisis, he became increasingly isolated. He had very few advisors at the very top, and that really restricted both the information flows coming to the president and the understanding of available options. And as a result, they made a number of really bad, important mistakes that led to the outcome that we saw in February. And finally, the lack of trust by the opposition in Yanukovych, the lack of any external enforcement mechanisms, made the job of Yanukovych making a compromise with the opposition much harder. If you remember, in January, he started making some concessions, maybe paying lip service to the concessions, offering Yatsenyuk a position of prime minister, but by that time, the opposition did not really trust any of his words. And because he had the total full control of power that he consolidated over the period of his presidency, it became really hard for him to actually make an agreement with the opposition that the opposition would trust. So these are 5 or 6 important elements that I think influenced the trajectory of the crisis, made it worse, accelerated Yanukovych's demise. And I will end with the 3 important turning points that I think influenced the trajectory of the regime. First was the decision to jail Tymoshenko. I think that decision was not detrimental necessarily from the standpoint of the effect on the opposition, but it postponed the signing of the association agreement with the EU that he could have done much earlier in his presidency. And it made it ultimately very politically risky for him to sign the association agreement as his term actually neared the very end. It also, as I mentioned, helped to unify the opposition because of that perception of the common threat. The second turning point was the decision to privilege his family clan over the political party, which alienated many oligarchs who then supported the opposition protests during Euromaidan. And it also strengthened the perception of extreme corruption at the very top. It created this understanding that they're actually crossing the line in terms of corruption. All of our rulers were corrupt to some extent, but that is something out of the ordinary. And finally, the final turning point was the decision to contain protests through the use of force at the very beginning, to use overt and covert force, rather than make early concessions to the protesters. I think if in December, let's imagine Yanukovych went and said, okay, let's sign an association agreement with the EU, which many actually in his close circle advocated at that time, I think we would have seen a different outcome to that crisis than what we've seen, and it would have been much less costly for the country in general and for the people who participated in these protests. Thank you.
Thank you, Serhiy. And next we turn to Lucan Way.
Great. Thank you so much. So the Euromaidan protests, I think, sort of as often happens in these events, generated enormous discussion of an emerging or sort of very strong civil society in Ukraine. But when I look at it, I see a kind of, this also is a reflection of a lack of clarity of what we mean by civil society and its role in democratization, both in Ukraine, but also broadly speaking in more transitional regimes. So basically my article and contribution and my discussion today basically looks at, I want to discuss 2 broad issues. How do we know whether a civil society is strong or weak in a particular case? And is civil society always good for democracy? And I think sometimes it's not. Now, if you look at depictions of civil society in Ukraine over the last quarter century since Ukraine entered the world consciousness, I think in 1989, when people knew that there was a place called Ukraine, so has evolved. So I think initially in the 1990s there was universally civil society in Ukraine, as in the rest of the former Soviet Union, was considered very weak for the most part. But then in the 2000s, with the Orange Revolution and the Ukraine without Kuchma and the emergence of powerful protest movements, civil society was oftentimes considered quite strong. And indeed, what's striking about Ukraine in the last 20 years, there have been 4 instances in which protest has led to the ouster of a major executive in 1990, 1993, 2004, and then most recently in 2014. So in a sense, the strength of civil society might seem self-evident, since the society has managed to kind of oust autocracy so many times. But in fact, I think it's actually a bit more complicated in that we shouldn't equate successful protest movements with a strong civil society. Now, of course, civil society itself, can mean pretty much anything you want it to mean. It could networks, a state of mind, you name it. I mean, I here use a kind of very organizational, institutional definition as a network of voluntary and autonomous organizations that exist outside the state and state, market, and family, and which are difficult for state leaders to dominate or eliminate or control. Now, I think to better understand sort of whether or not civil society is strong, I think it's useful to look at its different dimensions. And I argue there are 3 dimensions that are useful. One is sort of the degree of institutionalization or stability of organizations. In other words, if they exist over decades and remain influential over a long period of time, remain relatively stable, that's clearly an indication that civil society is relatively strong. The next 2 dimensions, which I think relate more specifically to protest, is what is their role in sort of mobilizing opposition protest or vocal opposition to the government. And I see sort of 2 roles here. One is as traffic cop, and the other as dispatcher. Now, traffic cop refers to the capacity of organizations to direct and manage protest that emerges. So traffic cops, you sort of tell, you have these opposition people come to the streets, they need to know where to go, they need to be fed, and whatnot, right? So that's a traffic cop. So dispatcher is actually the capacity to bring people onto the street in the first place, right? Get them actually onto the street. And basically, I think Ukrainian civil society has shown itself to be a fairly good traffic cop. Now, that we saw in the Euro Maidan this sort of emergence of what one leader called an independent republic, with its own border guards. I was actually caught on I was detained at the border once, I can tell you, and my papers weren't in order, and developed its own economy, quite quickly, on its own sort of leadership structure, although that was quite chaotic. But actually, there are 2 things. One, a lot of the organizations themselves were quite ephemeral, and what you have all the times during these protest events is that it's not that this civil society organization stimulates the protest, but the civil society organization itself is a product of the protest, right? So you have a number of of cases, both in the Orange Revolution, where organizations emerged just before the protest or was a product of the protest, so rather than the cause. That's one thing. And I think in general, civil society organizations, with a few notable exceptions, have been quite ephemeral in Ukraine. There hasn't been sort of anything equivalent to the sort of trade union movement in South Korea or the church in Poland or anything like that, with sort of both stability and influence. I also think that Ukrainian civil society has been a very weak dispatcher. One of the fascinating things that's come out of this protest is that if you look at surveys of how people came to the protest, about 75 to 90%, based on surveys, came on their own. In other words, family, friends. They weren't brought there by organizations. They just came basically spontaneously. So basically, you have a situation in which civil society is there, ready to direct the traffic, but it needs the protest needs to emerge basically spontaneously. So it's in that sense quite weak. It's just kind of dependent on the crisis emerging, and then they're sort of there to lead the protests. And in general, I think it's a mistake to equate large protests with a strong civil society. And indeed, if you look across the transition era since 1989, there have been a number of cases in which very large and sustained protests have basically not emerged out of a strong civil society, but more or less spontaneously. Recently, in Egypt in 2011, basically a lot of the protests did not emerge out of the strong Muslim Brotherhood initially. It was out of the secular groups which were quite, not very well organized. Cameroon and a number of cases in 1991, the ghost town, where you had literally millions of people protesting and striking throughout the country for almost a year. That was a case in which there was an extremely weak civil society. So I think it's important to basically not assume that sort of successful protest necessarily reflects a well-organized society. I think these are two separate things. And then also, I think it's a mistake to see, again, these successful protests as a sign of an emerging civil society. The second question is, well, is civil society even good for democracy? And I think Ukraine also shows us that this is actually a more complicated question than I think is given credit for. There's a famous essay by Sherry Berman on the Weimar Republic. Now, I'm not saying that Ukraine is right now the Weimar Republic. I just want to be clear for all the Russian agents out there. That Lucan Way did not say that. But she does make a point, which is that civil society, in a context of weak national institutions, can lead to heightened fragmentation and basically threaten social order. And I think that's one danger. And I think there's a danger to the extent to which civil society groups sort of mobilize, particularistic, polarizing messages that sort of divide Ukrainian society. I think that's a danger. And I'm thinking here of sort of the right sector in the work, to the extent that sort of on both sides there exists sort of more radical fringes. I think this clearly is not, this kind of mobilization is not good for democracy. And also, I think, even more directly, during the Euromaidan protests, the emergence of vigilante and violent groups, which basically take violence out of the state and put it in a sort of disorganized fashion, which I think directly promotes disorder and civil war. And I think in general, while we typically think of the issue in democratizing countries like Ukraine as being kind of society pressing up against an overbearing state, there's also the danger of when the state can no longer provide effective social order. Right? In a sense, I think in parts of Ukraine, that is the issue. So it's not as much about sort of fighting against an overbearing state, but the state is an essential component of democracy, and in a sense, that's maybe the central issue today in Ukraine. So.
Thank you, Lucan. And now we'll turn to Anders Aslund.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this invitation, both to speak here today and all the more so to contribute to your excellent Journal of Democracy. Of course, as we speak, Ukraine is in a critical situation, and far more important than what we speak about here is the national security. And it's quite amazing and shocking how little the West does for Ukraine's national security. Think of it that Ukraine has contributed with soldiers to Iraq, to Afghanistan, and what are we doing? But over to the topic here today. I think that Ukraine today has never had such good leaders as Poroshenko and Yatsenyuk. You can see one simple observation. These are the first president and prime minister speak English in Ukraine. And I consider both highly competent. And today, of course, the issue is what to do. But in order to answer that, we need first to answer the question, what went wrong? Therefore, I should say I'm writing a book right now, Ukraine's economy, what went wrong and how to fix it. And here you have a little piece about it, namely on the corruption, which is what Mark asked me to contribute about. There was a Minister of Finance in Russia in the fall of '96, Alexander Lifshitz, who died recently, and he formulated the essence of post-Soviet existence in politics and economics in 2 words. And those 2 words were nada delitsa. One has to share. And I think that one can summarize very much what Serhiy said here. This is what Yanukovych did not do. He did the fundamental mistake that he concentrated everything to yourself. It's a couple of years ago when I heard somebody, senior official in the tax administration in Lviv, who complained that previously everybody in the tax administration got their just cut. of the money they extorted from the taxpayers. But now they had to deliver everything up to the top, so that the people in the top could take it. And of course, this was morally wrong, as everybody can understand who works in a tax administration. When you hear such a thing, you understand that this regime is weak. And for reasons like this, we know pretty well how the corruption under Yanukovych functioned. Prime Minister Serhiy Kudelia accused the Yanukovych regime of stealing $37 billion during 4 years in power. Without having known this, I published an article some time ago and argued that the Yanukovych regime stole $8 to $10 billion from the government each year. And how do you do that? Well, these are the things that one first need to know before one deals with it. The classical Ukrainian way of enrichment is, of course, gas trade. How do you trade gas? Well, you buy gas that is produced locally, not from the Russians, for $53 per 1,000 cubic meters, and then you resell it on the commercial market at slightly more than $400 per 1,000 cubic meters. And how much money do you get? $350 per 1,000 cubic meters. The question is how many? My assessment is that it's probably 9 billion cubic meters, which makes a nice profit of $3 billion a year, which is the reason why Yanukovych was always against raising the gas prices, not for social reasons, but for very personal reasons. And the second way of making money, which is classical, what you do everywhere, it is public procurement. And this was particularly striking under the Euro 2012. The then Deputy Prime Minister for Euro 2012 and later infrastructure, Boris Kolesnikov, is now popular in Ukraine, called Borja Hyundai, because he went to South Korea and he saw a wonderful company, and he understood that this company can produce good trains for the Ukrainian railways. And then we don't know how the transactions was done, but it was done very fast. And he bought trains on behalf of the Ukrainian government from a company that had never produced broad gauge trains. And there are problems with these trains. They have been delivered. They can't take the winters in Ukraine, and they're out of operation most of the time. But this is how it's done. In another case, two deputy prime ministers against Boris Kolesnikov and Andrei Kluyev, they understood that the Voestalpine from Austria could not possibly produce a good soccer stadium in Lviv. So they decided to increase the price to the double and take care of the job themselves. Somehow the European Investment Bank didn't think that this was a good idea, so they had to take the whole cost from the Ukrainian government budget, which they did. And we'll take a third case, Yuri Boyko, the Minister of Energy. He thought that Ukraine should go for deep sea drilling in the Black Sea. So he bought 2 oil rigs from the Norwegian company Kværner for $800 million. That is, he bought it from his own company in England for $800 million, and that company only paid $450 million. So Yuri Boyko made a net cash out on $350 million. And that did not hurt him in his career. He advanced to deputy prime minister instead. So about $2 billion or so was taken out through this public procurement by a very small group of people. And then the third way of making money was the easiest. Ukraine seemed rather unique to me to have a special word for theft out of a state budget. Deriban. The verb is deribanit. So if you do something very often, you know you need a special word for it. For example, the Eskimos have several words for snow. We are satisfied with one, and Ukrainians need one special term for theft out of a state budget. So we add this up. That gives $3 billion from gas trade, $2 billion from state procurement, $3 to $5 billion from straightforward theft out of the government treasury, and then we get $8 to $10 billion a year, say $35, $40 billion in the course of 4 years. And this means 20% of GDP, which is on the high side, which is not very nice for the population. So then you can understand that they were unhappy. And then we go further to the parliament. Oleg Rybachuk, the former chief of staff of Viktor Yushchenko, has set up an NGO called Chesna, and they did something rather elementary. They checked the official declarations of incomes of the parliamentarians, which they actually have to give, and they checked how they lived. And they realized that none of the 450 members of parliament could possibly live on their official incomes. And then we come to the crux of the matter. Politics and economics hang together in the corruption. And the fundamental problem here is that Ukrainian elections are very expensive. My guess is that the elections in 2010 and 2012 respectively cost about $2 billion each. This last one cost much less. And then you need to have people who finance that. You need to finance it. And this means that each party needs big black financing. How do you get black financing? What can you sell? Well, of course, you can sell seats in parliament. $5 million can be the price. And you can also sell government jobs, in particular in the energy sector. That's very popular. They get very good prices for it. And here you get a vicious cycle of corruption. And then who takes care of this money? Well, each party has a grey cardinal, the names of whom are well known. And they are then taking in the money and selling the jobs. So, for example, in Ukraine now, even recently after Euromaidan, a minister is not allowed to appoint his deputies. The deputies are being sold to relevant people by the grey cardinals of each party. And then it's rather difficult to fight corruption. So you need to stop first this whole business. I think to a considerable extent that happened this year, because there are NGOs that check how much do the television ads cost, and that's the big cost. The other big cost that have been there, in particular for people like Yanukovych, is to buy election officials, so that they can facilitate the election, so that the results are suitable. And that can, of course, also be exposed to transparency. So the short of it is, one needs to go through multiple approaches. It's easy to say what should be done to clean up the economics. I mean, you increase the gas prices to a market level, and you introduce proper public audit and adopt a law on competitive public procurement. All that has been done now, but you must have transparency. Ukraine has adopted a far better law on public information than before, but I doubt it is right. And by and large, you need to sack them all, because we are stuck in this system. And the countries that have been most successful, Estonia and Georgia, have done exactly that. You take one state agency at a time. So if I remember rightly, in Georgia, they sacked 6,000 traffic police. No particular problem. They didn't have any traffic police during a few months. And then they got a decent traffic police. In the Baltic states, the probably most non-corrupt organization is the military, because they were all built up from the beginning with the Western support. So what I want to leave you with is the thought that one has to be very radical in these matters. Really clean up. Otherwise, one gets stuck by the old networks of corruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannes. And to conclude, we'll turn to Nadia Diuk.
Yes, thanks. I always learn something new when Anders speaks, and today I actually learned a new word in Ukrainian, which is actually quite astonishing. But it shows the creativity of the Ukrainian people, that they do manage to come up with words, Dereban, Titushke, and all of these sort of words that were somehow connected to the Maidan phenomenon. When Mark and I were discussing what my article should be about at the end, I mean, neither of us really had a very good idea of what I should write about, and he didn't really give me very much guidance either. So, I kind of threw out something like, well, what does this all mean? Where are we going in the future? What kind of new Ukraine is emerging? And he said, okay. So I think I'll just kind of be very schematic in some of the issues that I think, not necessarily that I covered in detail in my article, but some of the issues that I think all of these very excellent presentations and also the articles in the cluster that they sort of suggest about what this all means, not just for Ukraine, but for the development of politics and society in general, because I think any time that there is an uprising of this sort in Ukraine, it does give something to the world in terms of issues to think about and new paths to follow. The first, just naming some of those things that were new, and getting away a little bit from these jaw-dropping figures that I'm still sort of reeling from that Anders threw at us. What was new in the Maidan? This really was, I would argue, a very unique event. Even in Ukraine, where you had people on the Maidan before, that the scale of it and its duration, and also the violence that occurred later on were something very new, and I think something that really moved tectonic plates in the world, and especially in Ukraine. Another new element was the very regional character of the Euromaidan movement. Right from the start, it was a regional phenomenon. Another new element was the level of awareness.
What do you mean by a regional?
Oh, regional meaning within Ukraine. When you had, actually one thing that Mark did suggest was to compare this to the Orange Revolution, and that one of the items one of the features of the Orange Revolution was that most of the activity there really took place in Kyiv. Even though there were people coming from other parts of Ukraine, you didn't have your sort of like local Orange Revolution taking place in the same way that you had local Euromaidans taking place not only in Western Ukraine and in the center, but also in the south, and also, yes, in Donetsk and in Luhansk. It may have only been a handful of people, 20 or 30 people or so, but they did take place right from the beginning. Another new element as well was this sort of overbearing sense of that this is something new. This is we're re-examining our civic values, we're re-examining our moral values, and as well, as I said, the level of awareness of most of the people who were taking part was something that I found very new. Whereas in the Orange Revolution, there was just this kind of vague feeling of we want to get this government out of power. There wasn't the sense of what is it that we're actually striving for in the same way that you had with the Euromaidan and Maidan phenomenon. And then another new element which I think underpins a lot of what we might be hopeful for the future was the scale of self-organization. Whether this was by the civic groups or individuals in general, it promoted this sort of sense of volunteerism And also, if anyone was on the Maidan and saw how they managed to produce so many meals to feed so many people, and admittedly, we know that that all costs money. We know that it costs something like $70,000 to $80,000 a day to maintain the Maidan, and someone was paying for that. But nonetheless, the type of self-organization, I think, actually led to some new elements that we're going to see emerging in the future and be useful in the future as Ukraine moves forward. One area where I think we will be seeing where there is something new, again, is a new sense of unity in the country. Ukraine has always had politicians from east and west that come to contest the political landscape. Here we actually had, because the Euromaidan was a sort of, well, you could argue, with the exception of some of the eastern regions and also Crimea, it was almost a national phenomenon. And also you see now the elections reflected that. You had Petro Poroshenko being elected and really having the most votes in every region where it was possible to have an election. And I think this bodes very well for the future, where division of that sort has always been a problem. Now, unfortunately, the war in the east is also performing this function of uniting the rest of the people, but that is something that also will not go away soon. But I think that the benefit of it is that it is giving Ukrainians a new sense of purpose and also a type of patriotism that they never really had before. So I have in my notes new politics. Well, we saw what the old politics was based on: corruption, buying seats, and Andis's article in the journal really does actually itemize what the connection was between financial groups and political parties. I think he calls them, yes, Ukrainian parties, as he refers to them as organized crime syndicates. Up until now, I think that there has been that element that financial groups really have supported the political parties as they have existed in Ukraine up until now. And I think part of what the hopes during and after the Maidan was that ordinary people could now take part in governing their country and making their voices known as to how politics should take place. I would argue, though, that it takes a long time for new political parties to emerge, and I think there's a lot that needs to be changed in the system in order for them to be independent. But also we have seen the emergence of a lot of new civic actors, and I would say political actors on a local level, which is, again, fairly optimistic for the future. Anyone who was on the Maidan as well will remember that really it was the voice of the Maidan that was leading the politicians at that time. There were a number of occasions when the politicians who were there, mainly Tchernybok, Klitschko and Yatsenyuk, who represented the three main parties, had to actually step down from decisions that they had made, notably on February 21st, when they came to an agreement about how Yanukovych could stay in power till the end of the year. And the people on the Maidan voiced their protests and said, no, we don't want this to happen. And in fact, they prevailed. And then it actually led to more of the violence. But still, it was their voice that really brought that about. Another area that I wanted to highlight, and again, one that really we need to pay attention to in the future, that is going to play a much larger role, is the media. I think there have been some studies done about the role that the media played during the Maidan. The article by Serhiy Leshchenko is very good. I would attract your attention to that. And he mentions two areas which are of crucial importance. One, in a sort of general benign way, is that the innovations that took place in terms of media, the sort of live streaming of the revolution, which had never really quite taken place in that way before, the hearing the voices of ordinary citizens on internet TV, all of which shows that media is evolving and finding new ways to exist. But the second area is really the more the way that information and media is now being used as an instrument of war. The way that propaganda is being used to influence populations, the way that information is being packaged, not only in Ukraine, especially in Russia, but also in the Western world, to influence politicians and also influence policy and politics with regard to this area of the world. The last area is really the sort of most nebulous, and this was going to be the theme of my article, and that is identity. What is Ukraine's identity after all of this, and what does any of this mean? Well, Ukraine, since it has been an independent state, has always struggled with that sense of identity. The people in the West had a very different idea of what their history was. The people in the East had a very different idea of what their history was, and none of the presidents up until now had ever had any sort of policies really to bridge that gap and to provide some sort of vision of what a united Ukraine should be. Unfortunately, the war now is providing that vision, and I think also the new president also understands that this sense of a united identity is crucial for the future. If we're looking to see how political culture changes, the Maidan and what's happening now provides a sort of dramatic watershed. Up until now, there was always this sort of dichotomy between the people, the society, and the state. And in Ukraine, typically, the government was not the place where reforms took place. So that was why you often had this sort of pendulum swinging between the government would be full of sort of rent seekers and people who, for the most part, didn't wish to conduct any reforms. The society, led by civic groups, would get more and more sort of impatient and would be unhappy with the sort of growing authoritarianism that often took place with each president, with the exception of Yushchenko, where it was actually sort of breakdown of government in the end. And then you would get this sort of cycle of uprising, new government, and then the whole thing would repeat again. I think now there is a sort of new sense that the government can actually conduct reforms and is beginning to conduct more reforms than there have been in the past. So maybe we'll get a sense that there's something in Ukrainian political culture that is being changed. Maybe I'll just sort of, yes, I had in my notes here, the way that the Maidan has affected Europe, because after all, people were dying on the Maidan for European values, and I think the discussion in Europe should take place as to what really these values were about. I know that some intellectual journals have already started that discussion, but these are questions for Europe as much as they are for Ukraine. Also, I did have one thought, which was that Ukraine's diversity up until now, and a couple of people have mentioned this, has been the element, the ethnic diversity, the sort of financial group diversity has been the main, these have been the main features that have prevented Ukraine from becoming an authoritarian state. However, I had a kind of very heretical thought that if Ukraine becomes much more of a unified state in the future, and if democratic institutions don't take root rather quickly, we might actually be looking at a state that could be prone to being taken over by authoritarians in the future. So I think we can't be complacent. So what is to be done? I think a number of people have mentioned areas that need to be fixed, but I would mention three in particular. Establishing an independent judiciary, because then unless there is an independent judiciary, unless there are independent courts, independent judges, no efforts for combating corruption will succeed. And just to sort of restate, corruption is not a series of disconnected activities. It really is the sort of system that has operated in Ukraine up until now, both taking bribes and actually giving bribes as a way to feel somehow that you're affecting your future. The second area would be establishing a basis upon which authentic political parties can develop. And I think we've had in some of the articles in the journal some recommendations to take a close look at campaign financing, to detach business from politics, to revise the electoral system, and also to allow all of the new younger actors who started coming into their own on the Maidan to be able to enter politics in a very sort of authentic way. And then the third area, and I think this in the end may end up being one of the most important, is to establish truly independent and vibrant media as a way for investigating and gathering and conveying accurate information. This is going to be of utmost importance, not just for Ukraine itself, but as we see media now being manipulated much more often outside of Ukraine. I heard that Vladimir Putin was signing some new agreements in Latin America for expanding Russia Today into Latin America just over this weekend, in addition to watching the football. This is an area that will need some serious attention, and I think starting from the actual from Ukraine right now would be a good starting place for this to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. All four panelists actually did a very good job of summarizing, I would say, the highlights of their article. But now I would like to pose a question to all of them. Nadia got to it a little bit at the end of hers presentation, which is that these articles were mostly completed by the end of May. So about a month and a half has gone by since then. There's been a lot of news from Ukraine, although most of it is war news and so on. So the first thing I'd ask is there anything that's happened recently that's of particular note? For example, it's hard to know for someone who doesn't follow the country on a daily basis, like myself. Have some of the important reforms, either on the economic side and so on, have they been going forward? Is the government too distracted with trying to defend its territory to focus on these things? And then finally, if any of you would like to offer your thoughts about what the future will bring. I mean, I realize this is an impossible kind of thing to predict, but you know, one could say the pessimistic view would be that Ukraine is Egypt, and that you know, huge demonstrations, massive public participation, leading to free elections. But although obviously the circumstances are very different there, but nonetheless, somehow a reversion back to authoritarian ways, or is there, I mean, it's clear there are strong sentimental reasons for thinking that's not the case, and the changes in culture, identity, all those things I accept are very real, but the question is, are they enough to really change the political trajectory of the country? So let me just see if any of you would like to respond for 2 minutes to that, and then we'll turn it to the audience.
All right. So I'll focus, first of all, on the institutional side of things. And my article ends with the question, what's next? What institutional changes should be made for Ukraine to become a consolidated democracy? And here on this side, I don't think we have a lot of good news so far. President Poroshenko submitted his constitutional draft, and that's constitutional changes have been discussed widely starting from March onwards, and the substance of these constitutional changes have also been discussed. One element to that substance has been the discussion about decentralization as an attempt to quell some of the separatist sentiments in eastern parts of Ukraine. The second dimension of that has been resolving some of the problems of overlap of functions between the Prime Minister and the President that the current constitutional draft presents. So we've seen the 2004 Constitution work under Yushchenko and has been a particularly effective constitution. It allowed for more democratic governance, but it did not allow for much more of effective economic governance. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of public debate. We haven't seen much of an attempt by President Poroshenko to appeal to the civil society to contribute their views on what the constitutional changes should be. In fact, the draft that he offered, submitted to the parliament last week, that draft was really a revelation even for some members of the parliament, including the members of the governing coalition, the ruling coalition from the Batkivshina party. They issued a statement that they were not consulted on the substance of these constitutional changes. And when you actually read the draft, you understand why. Because rather than limiting the powers of the president, again, there is a hidden attempt by President Poroshenko to strengthen the control of the president over the coercive agencies. The president would gain additional powers to dismiss the prosecutor general, to dismiss the head of the security service, and to appoint and dismiss without the parliament's consent the head of the new agency called the State Bureau of Investigations, which is supposed to be the key anti-corruption arm of the state. In addition to that, there has been also an attempt to basically create what some of my colleagues call stealth re-centralization, meaning trying to present a decision to abolish the institution of state administrations in the regions as evidence of decentralization, but in fact replacing those with the so-called representatives of the president in different oblasts, which would have broader powers than the heads of the regional state administrations had before. So, for example, if they would disagree with the decision of the oblast or city council, they could submit or challenge that decision in the constitutional court, and eventually the president, if the constitutional court rules that that decision of the local council was unconstitutional, the president would have the power to actually dissolve the local council. If that is called decentralization, I kind of question the term itself, how Poroshenko understands that. So these were the elements that sort of create a lot of questions to me on whether the current president is committed to some of the reforms that Anders talked about, that I wrote in the article. We'll see what the ultimate draft will be. It doesn't seem like the draft that the president submitted is going to get support in the parliament. So this is one set of issues I wanted to discuss. And the second element that I wanted to mention in regard to the effect of war is, I think, a change in the psychic of the society that has been gradually developing over the last several months. And the effect, the real impact of that change, I think it's too early to really make any judgments, but it creates certain concerns. So in general, if you look at the studies of domestic conflicts, you would see that they have really negative effect on the general level of tolerance in the country, the general level of mutual trust between individuals, between citizens. So there are a lot of costs as far as just the basic democratic values that members of the society hold, that these conflicts present. And I think, based on what I'm hearing and listening and talking to my colleagues and friends, I think we're moving in that direction, unfortunately, when we are seeing definitely a lower tolerance of, for example, people from one region towards people from eastern Ukraine, Donbass, greater negativity, attempts at dehumanizing, using the dehumanizing terms to describe these individuals from Donbass who hold different political views. And in general, I think the effect of on the psychic of the coffins that come, and I'm from Western Ukraine, I listen a lot of news from Lviv and Western Ukraine, and this is the first time that we have to go through that process of actually seeing the coffins that are shipped of soldiers from one part of the country to another of the people who are being killed by our co-ethnics. Yes, there are Russian agents, there are Russian security services, but the truth of the matter is something that the Ukrainian government is recognizing and the US government is now recognizing, is that many of the people who are actually fighting are the locals from Donbass, who, for whatever reasons, believe that this is the right cause. And I think that effect on that of that fact may be quite strong negative repercussions for the values that people hold.
Lucan? Yeah, thanks. So I actually, I think Serhiy and I share a somewhat more pessimistic view of the future than Anders and Nadia. But and I agree that it's interesting looking at these protests that there definitely was a much more spontaneous character to these protests than there were in 2004. In fact, they remind me most of actually 1989, 1991 in the sense of handmade signs and whatnot. But there's a good side and a bad side to this, right? I mean, the good side is you get new voices. The bad side is that they're really disorganized. And it's quite striking that you have these massive demonstrations of people who want to wipe the slate clean. And what do you get? Drum roll, please. Founding member of Yanukovych's Party of Regions is now in charge, Petro Poroshenko. You basically, because you basically wiped the slate. You don't have any very few organized parties. The existing party system has been destroyed. And also, I think the spontaneity means that you had actually in this a lot of very divisive rhetoric. Right. And the irony was that the opposition was intensely moderate in its actual actions, right? But it just created like a complete opening for Putin to take these symbols. A colleague of mine once referred to it. It's like taking a Confederate flag in Harlem, right? I mean, this is incredibly divisive stuff that again created a PR disaster of epic proportions and just made it very easy sort of for Putin to go in and make havoc. Right? It's much easier to convince Eastern Ukrainians who only get Russian TV that there are fascists in charge if you have divisive symbols on television to do that. Those of us knew that at the time. Some of us wrote about it. They said, no, we're actually liberals. I believe them, they are. But symbols are important. And I think they've had disastrous consequences in Ukraine. So I think at the same time, I think so I think in a sense it is like a little bit like Egypt in the sense that I think you have high fluidity among the pro-democratic forces and you have a lot of good people, but you don't necessarily, they aren't sort of sufficiently well organized to consolidate their gains. I think the big difference is, and this is where the war comes in, at one level I think Serhiy is right that increases sense of intolerance towards opposition. I totally agree, you hear words like lumpen and sort of dehumanizing rhetoric about the East. At the same time, the war also makes Ukraine intensely that much more dependent on the West, which I think provides an opening for us, National Endowment for Democracy and others, to really press the government for democratic reform. And I think in that sense, it's an opportunity for Western policymakers.
Thank you. A few different points. I do agree with Serhiy on the Constitution, but if you have a president writing the Constitution, do you think that he will reduce his powers? I think this has to be an iterative process simply. Second point, this Ukrainian government, since the 27th of February, has promulgated more good economic legislation than Ukraine has ever adopted before. This is a tremendous step forward. And this has been given very little attention because of the other things. But Prime Minister Yatsenyuk made a speech on the 4th of July complaining that 24 of laws had now not gone through the parliament. This parliament is finished. The 1/3 or so of defectors from the regions in the middle have now essentially defected from the government. The parliament has to be dissolved as soon as possible for the process to go forward. And hopefully we will see new elections in October. I think this should be the focus now, and we can forget about new laws being adopted. Mark asked, is this Egypt or Tunisia? It's Tunisia. The similarity is that in Tunisia, the ruling family had successfully concentrated the corruption to themselves. They didn't allow other people to benefit from the corruption, while in Egypt, corruption is and was quite evenly spread throughout the administration. So people are not so upset with the old system. In Tunisia, people were really upset about corruption because they didn't get the fruit from corruption at the middle level. And that makes me hopeful. Another reason to be hopeful is that most of the big oligarchs are broken. Akhmetov will never be the same. Taruta, who was not very strong to begin with, is very badly weakened. Firtash is out on bail in Vienna. The only serious oligarch standing is Kolomoisky. And I think that Poroshenko's big task will be to, when the national security situation has been sorted out, is to take down Kolomoisky and make sure that he stays within the limits. So this could be the big blowout of the oligarchs. And of course, Yanukovych took out the oligarchs himself because he wanted to have their wealth, and did so quite successfully. And then we have a free trade agreement with the European Union. 98% of Ukrainian goods can now be exported to Europe without tariffs and quotas. There are certain standard and quality issues, but that Ukraine can solve on its own. And then finally, what about the situation? I remember Charles Tilley's words, states are created through war. And that's unfortunately the typical process. I think both independence and the Orange Revolution were just too easy, so that Ukraine didn't got itself together. I think that Putin can provide wonderful assistance in this regard.
Thank you, Anders. Nadia, do you want to add anything?
Just very briefly, you know that there are a lot of anecdotes going around Ukraine now about how helpful Lenin had been to Ukraine because he provided borders, Stalin because he brought in the west of Ukraine, Khrushchev because he actually attached Crimea to Ukraine, and Putin because he made the Ukrainians hate Russia. So a lot of popular culture anecdotes like that. But basically, I just wanted to repeat that as again that with this parliament, you can't have this type of new presidency without having a new parliament, and that the president should find a way to assist the parliament to dissolve as soon as possible. Because in the instances where the parliament, there has been an old parliament and a new president, it's never really worked out very well, and this would also help clear the way for new party politics. I'm glad to hear the news about the oligarchs, that they're broken, although I think that they still probably have a little breath left in them still. But I would say that here, this is where the Western world also has a role to play. The oligarchs didn't become oligarchs just in and of themselves. They're all using the Western banking systems, and as well, in particular, the US banking system to circulate money around. So I think it depends a bit on the Western world as to how those oligarchs be allowed to reestablish themselves, and will oligarchs outside of the Ukrainian sphere in the neighboring countries be allowed to have an effect. And this is where I do want to also mention the Russia factor, which also came into the set of articles with an excellent article by Lilia Shevtsova, that this also is an element that is not going away, and it doesn't depend just on Ukraine as to fight away the incursions on its sovereignty, that the Western world should also be paying attention, although Ukraine seems to be doing quite well on its own right now. But I would say that, in a sense, do we want Ukraine to become Egypt? Are we going to allow Ukraine to become Egypt, or is it Tunisia? Well, it depends a little bit on Western support too. You can't just leave it all to the Ukrainians. And as a final word as well, yes, I think the Ukrainians learned finally that freedom is something worth fighting for, and that's something that's entered their psyche for the first time for a long time.
Thank you, Nadia. Now let's turn to the audience. We have a mic which we will bring around, and please identify yourself and your affiliation before speaking. So first here, second in the back.
Hi, my name is Helen Lurie. I'm not affiliated with any organization, but I am, an independent activist who cares about the future of Ukraine. My question, sort of riffing off the last point that Nadia made about Western support and Anders' point about lack thereof, or relative lack thereof. And this is taking things outside the purely Ukrainian context and sort of moving them into internal Western country and U.S. politics. My question is, for those of us who think there should be more support from the West, from Ukraine, what strategies do you suggest using to increase support, and which groups, if any, do you see being most successful at encouraging support for Ukraine?
Thank you. And we'll take a few questions successively.
John Kunstadter, Red Zima Photo. I'd first like to say, for those of us who have worked with Ned either in the U.S. or abroad, congratulations on 3 decades of outstanding work. I've got 2 questions, please, and they're provoked by things people have said. First of all, Lucan Way said that the church in Ukraine is not like it is in, or it was in Poland, doesn't play the same role. And granted, there are 5 main confessions in Ukraine, but I would be very interested, given the stature of Patriarch Filaret or people like Boris Hudziak, for the panel's assessment of the role that the 3 Orthodox and 2 Catholic confessions are playing in Ukraine. The second question is a broader one. It's keyed to what Anders Aslund said and Nadia Diuk said about what Ukraine faces and the, I'd have to call it, gelded response of the West. Ukraine's at war, a war declared by Vladimir Putin, and that means if Ukraine's at war, then the West is at war. And I'd like to know if the panel can answer why it is that the Western world does not see that the men who were killed on Institutska and Grushevska died as much for our freedom as for Ukraine's, and that the war that the Ukrainians are waging against the Russian-backed, in fact, let's call it, I mean, it's really a Russian invasion, is again an expression of the kind of Western values that the EU and the US seem afraid to defend. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mark?
My name is Mark Nelson from the Center for International Media Assistance. I wanted to make a link between what Nadia said and what Anders said, and I wanted to ask Anders about the link of media to the corruption issue. I mean, to what extent do you think the media has played the sort of coordinating role in that system? And if you're seeing signs that this could be broken up, what implications are there for the media, in Ukraine, and how might it be financed in the future? I mean, that's been the issue for media in that country, is that it has not been financed through providing information to the population so much as being a way of organizing influence and peddling that influence openly in the country.
Okay, why don't we take any responses anyone has to those first 3? Anders?
Yeah, let me pick up here on the media. Frankly, I think that Ukrainian media are excellent, almost by any standard. I look up on Ukrainska Pravda or Serhiy Kudelia, and I get a free agency service that is far superior to anything that I get anywhere else. Tim Snyder has made the wonderful point that the best Russian language discussion and the best Russian media in the Russian language are now in Ukraine. And given that we have about 10 different television channels owned by different people, we get a strong competition by them. And I don't follow this closely. I'm sure that Nadia and Serhiy follow this more closely. But what I've seen from Telekritika is that the Pinchuk ICTV and Kolomoisky Adin plus Adin 1+1, that they have been pretty correct and neutral. So I think that this is actually quite a good situation, and the only strongly pro-Yanukovych channel was the state channel and also the parliamentary channel. Poroshenko's Channel 5 has been strongly oppositional. TVI with different ownership has been swinging back and forth. So I think that this is a much more satisfactory situation than we see, for example, in this country. So I don't see any problem. And let me come back here to Nadia's point about independent courts. We don't want independent courts in Ukraine because every judge, as we know them, is corrupt. We don't, so if you look up on the Constitution as it now stands, the highest court of justice, which appoints judges, has 20 members. 3 of these members are supposed to be appointed by the Congress of Judges. That means that the judges reproduce themselves and by definition are corrupt. Then you have 3 more that are appointed by the Congress of Lawyers. And the Congress of Lawyers is controlled by Yanukovych people still. And so there we have 3 more corrupt judges. And then we continue to the departments of law at the universities. For some reason, the Congress of Departments of Legal Departments is not including the reformist universities. They keep them out. So here we have 3 more corrupt judges. So if we have independent judges according to courts, according to the current constitution, we guarantee corruption forever. So what can be done? Well, you want to have foreign appointed judges. You want to have bring in North American judges, bring in the Council of Europe to clean up this mess, suspend the chapter on justice. I think it's chapter 8 in the Constitution for 5 years at least, and sack every single judge that you can see in the country, because if they have been able to work as judges in Ukraine, they have to be corrupt. Otherwise, they would not have the job. And this comes, Marc F complained very much about this because the European institutions, when Estonia wanted to become a member of the European Union, insisted on the independence of a court system. So we should rather say clean up the court system from corrupt judges, rather than saying that it should be independent, because independent corrupt judges is truly awful. Thank you.
Serhiy, did you want to respond to any of these?
Yeah, I always learn so much from Anders when he comes up. I think we're not in disagreement. Again, it's a warning to all of us to not use terms loosely, but a court system that has been cleaned out. And in fact, I think one of the first steps that this lustration committee was looking at was actually to fire all of the judges. And there was an article written as to, if you actually fired all of the judges that there are in Ukraine now, that the way that some of the law schools are actually producing young people, you could actually replace them all within within a couple of years. So it's not going to be as dramatic as it sounds. But you're right that's to clean it out. Didn't you mention something about some stables in your article? Anyway, on media as well, I think media in Ukraine is about as strong as it can be, but unfortunately it's not sort of getting out of the boundaries of Ukraine. So a lot of the information of what is going on in Ukraine tends to sort of stay in Ukraine, and I think it would be a good exercise to either have some Russian language stations that are using that information for other countries of the post-Soviet space where we hear that the Kremlin has actually won the information war, and to bring also some of that information into Western Europe, and also to supplement information that's coming to the United States. How can it be financed in the future? Well, it's again, difficult to know how you move from one form of ownership to another, but I know that there have been calls for Petro Poroshenko to sell his news, to sell his TV channel. But then my question is, well, who would he sell it to under the current circumstances? I think maybe on some of the other items I'll defer to Serhiy.
Well, maybe just very brief comment on the last question. So I think the risk, I mean, I understand the arguments for the more muscular support assistance to Ukraine. I understand the argument for provision of arms. I understand where it's coming from. I personally think that this will only reinforce the myths that the insurgency has been using and that Putin has been using to strengthen domestic resistance to Ukrainian authorities. The United States is not very popular in Donbass, and if people in Donbass would suddenly realize that they're being killed using the kinds of arms that America supplies, I don't think it will make it easier for the Ukrainian government to reestablish its authority over Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. We have to simplifying it and presenting it as a pure Russian invasion, I think, is doing us more harm than good from the analytical standpoint. We have to recognize that the support for that insurgency, the local support, has been there from almost very beginning. Ukrainian government recognized that over 30% of the population participated in the so-called referendums in Donetsk and Luhansk, that there is a considerable support for greater autonomy, if not full-fledged secession from Ukraine, and there should be a different dialogue, a different there should be a different way of talking to these people other than just saying, let's bomb you into submission. And that's why I think the United States really needs to play a role of a more neutral broker than it has been playing so far. I think the spokespersons from the State Department got a gift from heaven for the Russian propaganda. The kind of arguments that I've been hearing them making, saying that denying the refugee reports, refusing to talk about the collateral damage, about the civilians who are being constantly killed in Luhansk and Donetsk, all of that unfortunately only serves the Russian propaganda. So personally, I would prefer to have the United States work in a more advisory role, provide its shared experience with counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, the key lesson from these counterinsurgency operations is that the military force is only 10% of the solution. 90% of the solution in counterinsurgency is political. And only through the political settlement, through the institutional guarantees to these areas, we can solve this conflict sustainably. That's my take on it.
I just want to respond about the issue of sort of cleaning the stables. And I definitely sort of understand that sort of the rationale behind that, and that Georgia most recently provides a good example. At the same time, I guess I'm a small c conservative. That you fire everyone. In the ideal circumstance, you bring in new people and new system, less corruption. There's also a dystopian version, which is that you create a new opportunity for a new ruling clique, corruption to sort of, patronage to distribute to their friends. So I think there are dangers fraught in this sort of radical transformation. And I think that it's especially in a country that's obviously substantially larger than Georgia or Estonia, right? Where I would imagine you can't just have one hire them all centrally. There's going to be decentralization, and it could just make things. I mean, one thing I've learned in study of Eastern Europe, things can always get worse. And I think that we have to keep that in mind. You're shaking your head. You think things can't get worse. I think they can. So I think that I think it's something to keep in mind. Not that I have a solution, but.
More around it.
Seen a number of radical reforms that have succeeded. We have not seen any conservative reform with little c succeeding in the post-communist. If you have a choice between a hopeless attempt and an attempt that is sometimes successful, then I think you should go for a second.
Please be brief. We don't have much time. 1, 2, and 3 in the back there.
Hi there. My name is Dawn Rosser. I'm unaffiliated, but I have a question regarding humanitarian status. And I was wondering, do any of you on the panel know what the humanitarian status is currently of those who are fighting and defending Ukraine right now, whether they have enough military aid, and how is that aid getting to them in case there is sort of a bottleneck in the government that would facilitate that?
Good afternoon. My name is Kevin, and I work with the Advisory Council for Bosnia and Herzegovina. My question is, how does our situation in Ukraine affect the Balkan region? And my reason for asking that is because Republika Srpska's leadership is the only leadership that supports the annexation of Crimea.
Well, my question is to...
You identify yourself?
Okay, my name is Vadim Gorbach. I work for the World Bank. My question is to all the members of the panel. It's about agents of change. As Ms. Nadia mentioned, the systemic radical reforms that are needed in Ukraine right now will require dismantling the whole system essentially. The political system, the campaign system, the accountability systems, all of that needs to be changed. If the president if the president's powers are restricted, do you think the parliament is gonna, shape the political will to introduce this systemic change? And who exactly do you see as the agents of change? Do you see the existing parties being able to step forward, or do you think some new players are going to have to push it? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, why don't we then give each of our panelists a chance to make a brief response, and then we'll conclude. Anders, you want to go first?
Yeah, if I can take the last question. When you get a positive change, there are always the same kind of people almost coming through. Young professionals, outsiders of the administration, often educated abroad. And Ukraine now has 20 to 30,000 students graduating from European universities each year. They are not coming home. Hardly any of these people come home. So attract some, and you will get a massive change. The most successful reform government in Eastern Europe was in Estonia in '92. The prime minister was 32 years old. There were 3 members of the cabinet who were younger than 30. You need people who really know that they have to change things, who are not vested to the old system in order to get the change.
Thank you. Lucan, your final words?
I guess again, I would just, I worry that, that because you have new generation or new people coming into power does not necessarily mean they're going to be less corrupt than the old people. I mean, in other words, I think, and I guess when to take an example like Estonia, which had a very strong sense of national identity, and threat from Russia. I'm not. I just don't. I don't necessarily. Don't necessarily see those conditions in Ukraine. I think I agree with all of you. I do think that Putin is probably the best force for Ukrainian reform there exists, and there's a sense of urgency that has never existed before in Ukrainian society. But I guess I would be just reluctant to sort of create simply new opportunities for corruption.
Yes, on Vadim's question, I also don't think that the radical change will come quickly. There was initially some expectations that Ukraine will try to replicate the Georgian miracle and use some of the Saakashvili's advisors, Bendukidze and others, for that purpose. I hear from my Georgian friends that there are many Georgians in different levels of government advising the Ukrainian authorities, but it doesn't seem like there is a political will to do the similar things that Saakashvili did, and I don't think they have a capacity to do that, both given the size of the country and given the kinds of challenges that we face as far as the threat to the territorial integrity of the state is concerned. Regarding the agents, I am a believer in the conditionality. I think most of the Central European states, they did as well as they did primarily because of the external pressure. And I agree with Lucan that given the fact that Ukraine so much depends now on Western aid, on Western public political support, I think that's a big incentive for the authorities to actually start implementing some of the changes that they have been promising for a long time.
Just briefly on the humanitarian aid question, I'm not sure whether the government is actually coping with the humanitarian situation all that well. But here again, it's another area where self-organization is really working very well. Like raising funding for both military equipment and for the soldiers, and also for the humanitarian situation, is another way that the Ukrainian society is sort of self-organizing and really sort of moving. Creating new ways. On the broader political issues, I'm all in favor of shock therapy. I think it's shown that it works in the economy. I would like to see shock therapy in politics, and maybe Ukraine, although I don't know how you would accomplish this, but maybe a few more people should think about it and see whether it could work. Shock therapy in terms of changing institutions, changing personnel, changing people, because I think what happened in Ukraine in the last year shows that maybe we should really be thinking of is there a new relationship between society and the state that governs it that may emerge out of this whole experience, and I think maybe political scientist heads should come together with the politicians in Ukraine and see if that might happen.
Thank you. Anders indicated he had one more.
Yeah, let me just come back. I mean, what we really need is new elections. The argument that people are not ready, as Lucan and Serhiy said now, it's true about the current establishment. That's why the establishment needs to be renewed. How do you renew the establishment democratically? Through new elections. So I think that we should expect something to happen after the new elections have taken place. If there are no new elections, then I agree with you. This was the big mistake of the Orange Revolution, not to have early parliamentary elections. You can see generally with post-communist countries, the countries that had early elections got more radical reforms more easily, or it was easier to carry them out. Not altogether, but it was a positive factor. And if you don't start radically, you won't succeed. That's what we have very clear lessons from all the transitions. Sometimes a country can come back, as Slovakia did in 2003, but they have got a lot of things done very well. Size, Poland is about the same size as Ukraine. It was a terrible mess in 1989. Now we don't remember because the Balcerovich reforms were so successful. Finally, conditionality doesn't work. That's what the IMF and the World Bank have come to rather broad conclusion. It's helpful to maintain what has been achieved, but you don't do reforms from through conditionality. Reform must come from the country itself.
Thank you, Anders. You suggested a way of possibly narrowing the differences, but I think one of the interesting things about this panel has been the division into conservatives and radicals along lines I wouldn't.
Conservatives and older radicals.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily have predicted. In any case, I think all the panelists have done a wonderful job, and I ask you to join me in giving them a round of applause. And thank you all for coming.